have a very sophisticated organization behind the conference who's working to make the online stream live, which should be starting any second now, so we can officially begin this discussion. We have two presentations today, and we are joined here by Lilian Zurdi and Davide Donatiello, who will present respectively one work in progress project and one paper that is finished already, but still open to further elaborations for the future. We begin with Davide Donatiello, who is presenting a paper also on behalf of two co-authors, Magda Bolzoni and Leila Giannetto. Davide is a professor of sociology at the University of Turin, and the title of the paper is Sailing Against the Low Tides, the implications of the 2018 refugee reception in small and medium towns and rural areas in Italy. Davide will present for about 20 minutes. So then we have another 20-25 minutes for questions and answers. We have about 15 people in the room and another 50 people online, I'm told. So if you have questions and you are online, please do write them down on the chat, and we will make sure to collect them for the question and answer section. And Davide, now the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and good morning, everybody. The paper I'm about to present is on the implication of the so-called Salvini decree on reception in small, medium towns and rural areas in Italy. Is the result of research activity shared with Magda and Leila. They can't be here, but I suppose they are connected following the event online. We are very glad to have this opportunity to discuss our paper with you. So many thanks for organizing this seminar. Before illustrating the main contents of the paper, I show the structure of the presentation as we have organized the presentation, a brief introduction to clarify the interest at the basis of our research. Then the presentation of the analytical framework, the analytical proposal that is, in our expectation, is the core of our argument, and we intend to discuss with you this point. Then a briefly introduction of the research design and the cases investigated, and some insights from the fieldwork related to both material and symbolic dimension in the territory reception nexus. And last, if I have enough time, I will conclude highlighting some final remarks. Over the past decades, asylum seekers and refugees arriving in Italy were accommodated in reception facilities located not only in large urban centers, but also in small medium towns and rural areas. The crucial role of the local level is a controversial issue, but this role is also easy to observe, especially in front of the lack of an organic and stable approach to reception at national level. We have observed in last years discrepant reaction from local communities, but quite or in part surprising, small town and rural areas are also responsive settings in terms of activating innovative solutions to respond to challenges due to the arrival of migrants and to the regulatory changes. So the role of local remain a controversial issue because we are aware that it is only a part of the story. Not all experiences of reception before Salvini decrees were positive, but as I said above, quite surprisingly, in this high heterogeneity of practices and experiences, we can observe some virtuous interconnection between reception experience and territorial development. In terms of local development and evolution of territories. Our analysis is focused on this kind of positive and virtuous interconnection. Interconnection put under stress by normative changes introduced with the Salvini decrees in 2018. The presence of migrants, of forced migrants in small town and rural areas has become increasingly consistent, important, relevant from 2014 with the agreement between government, regions and local authorities on dispersal policies. The logic is that of share burden among territories to promote socio-economic integration of migrants, to promote part of socio-economic integration, to assure proximity and opportunities of continuous interaction with residents. Several phases can be distinguished in the history of reception system reform. They reveal an increasingly importance of small and rural area, small and medium town, and we take into consideration that is a relatively new phenomenon, that is the presence of migrants in non-urban area. But this fact legitimates the idea to deeply explore implication of reception policies at the local level, because the question become where asylum seekers and refugees are hosted, and if those territories are placed to facilitate or not their integration. So also the progressive and increasing involvement of a variety of local actors is a crucial passage. But territories in rural area, peripheral area, mountain area are often problematic because they tend to represent an impoverished context with the problem concerning the fact that they are isolated, they have limited public transports, for example, they are unprepared to host migrants because in some cases they have no previous experiences in facing the presence of migrants. Many of these territories have economy in distress,
Davide, can I interrupt for a second? I think we have a problem with the mic. Oh.
Okay, thanks. Inexorable decline for those territories. So we can shift to our analytical framework, the intersection, the virtuous intersection we talk about are at the center of the analytical, this analytical frame. This matrix is to frame and address both the unexpected effect, the surprising effect of connected to the presence of reception initiatives, and also the disrupted effect connected to the Salvini decree. The matrix is formed by the intersection of two pairs. The first within around is concerning the orientation our look takes, namely the setting in which we observe changes and implication, distinguishing between the reception structures and the management of reception on one side, and on the other, the territorial setting around the reception facility. So the second pair, material symbolic, allow us to distinguish material concrete aspect and immaterial, keeping them separate. This is an analytical device. Obviously, all those dimensions are not mutually exclusive, but rather overlapping. And when I discuss the cases, I try to show the overlapping, they are overlapping. So our research is part of a broader research aiming at investigating the implication of refugee, of Salvini decrees on in a local area, and it was an investigation funded by Fondazione Migrantes. I want just to go. Okay. Some words, further words about the analytical framework. The first box within and material concern internal characteristics of the reception structures in terms of organization, functioning, and service supplied. The second box within and symbolic refers to the meaning assigned to the concept of reception and integration by people working in and managing reception. This point is very important because concern the philosophy of the idea behind the way through which the reception is carried on. So we can observe a variety, a high variety of situation, but also concerning the standards, the qualitative standards of reception. But the point is that in cases we have explored, the managing institution tend not only to be a provider of food and shelter, but promote a solution focusing on the integration of and autonomy of beneficiaries. For example, several cases where many beneficiaries are hosted follow the sparsi proimi model, or take into consideration the guidelines of ordinary emergency. The lower half of the matrix is on interconnection between around and material or symbolic aspect. The around material box bring attention to material side of such interconnection we have talked before, and also referring to the reception economy, all surprisingly and positive effect that boosted the local economy. Instead, the forward box is around and symbolic, focus on the material implication that the presence of reception may bring in small towns and rural areas. For example, the presence of migrants force the local community to face the issue of diversity. It could also bring tension and conflict, but it's at the basis of a process to create a welcoming community, a local welcoming community, and also a rediscovery, a traditional identity of territories. And so we can observe how to create, to develop the local setting, keep together with the creation of a welcoming community process. Okay, to address this issue, we selected 3 eloquent cases: Irpinia and Sannio, Pistoia and Valdinievole, Ivrea and Epurediese. In each of these territories, we find managing institutions that are present from several years. They have had a transformative role in the local context. They have developed the interconnection with many actors, and they are protagonists of a positive combination between the reception, the inclusion of migrants, and the transformation of local context. So we can move quickly to words coming from speech of people we have interviewed, just to briefly highlight some implication due to the decree entered into force. Here, concerning the within material point, we can observe how the budget cuts for asylum seekers forced a rethinking of internal services provided, and also a significant reduction in the number of operators, for example, and their action, the possibility to intervene with the actual action supporting the beneficiaries. But the new restrictions also had an impact on within symbolic dimension. Here we intend to highlight the sense of frustration has spread among operators connected to the idea of failure of the reception model previous developed. Obviously, this dimension is interrelated with the previous one, and the sense of frustration is linked also to the budget revision that required a reorganization of staff, loss of skill, and so on. Here we can observe how the removal of humanitarian protection increase in burden and expenditure for public local services. So local authorities in this context have to cope with an increased demand of social assistance, for example. And this is an example or implication on around the material dimension. Last, if we consider the around symbolic dimension, we can observe some consequences of the politicization of reception and an anti-immigrant rhetoric with the effect of to intensificate mistrust and hostility that were previously rare in those contexts. Okay, I can conclude just saying that the 2008 security decrees tend to jeopardize such virtuous interconnection. Okay. Through further experience of research, the first one on double standard and ambivalence of solidarity towards Ukrainian refugees, and the second on how the professionalization and territorial skill of reception workers can affect the interconnection, the virtuous interconnection between reception and territories. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Davide. I'm happy to open the floor for questions now. If you're online, please write your questions on the chat, and I should be able to see your questions on one of the 5 screens that are in front of me somewhere. If you're in the room, simply raise your hand, and I will collect questions now. Yes, I can see Andrew, Julia. Andrew, please.
Thank you, David. That's really interesting. So I didn't have a chance to read the paper, but I found your framework really quite fascinating. But one of the things I was interested in within your framework, you talk about material and symbolic factors. But this kind of research, I wonder if it's also interesting, or maybe it's accommodated within the framework, think about kind of cognitive factors. In a sense, because this is a process of interaction between kind of a host community and newcomers. You'd imagine that then there's a process of learning, acquisition of knowledge on both sides, which could then affect attitudes, could affect the kind of the local salience of the issue, could also affect mobilization. So I wondered if within your research, you've also taken account of these kind of processes of knowledge acquisition, the way it can affect particularly politicization, because I wasn't sure how levels of politicization featured in your local analysis, though I can see it as a national factor. But I wondered about this cognitive dimension. Thank you.
Davide, is it fine if we collect a few questions? I've seen Julia, Marina, Martin. I also have questions. For those who are online, you will be able to access the paper because it has been published already. So we'll make it available. Julia, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very interesting, although I would prefer to hear more about this research just to understand more. Well, I have 2 questions. The first one is a question, rather a comment. I saw that the table of these aspects that you presented within, around, material, symbolic, so they were rather positive, especially those symbolic ones, and I just couldn't help but wonder, like, how does this relate to the fact that actually those asylum seekers that stay, especially on the south of Italy, they are well, not equally paid for the jobs that they do. They are because, as we all know, they are working mostly in agriculture, and in many places they are paid much less than the locals, or like other let's say more privileged migrants. In some places they paid like €3 per day. So how does this make them feel? Does this make them feel welcomed in those places, and how does it affect their willingness to stay or to move somewhere else? And the second question is related to this one. So basically, what aspect made them decide to stay in those small communities, or are they prefer to just move somewhere else, as if they have this possibility?
If that's fine, I'll continue to collect questions. Please stop me when they get too many.
Okay, thank you. I'm Marina Kieda, I'm from Ukraine, and I have read your paper. It is very interesting, really. Thank you very much, and for sending it beforehand. And I have such a question. Did you try to research somehow any positive or negative changes in implementation of this law towards Ukrainian migrants? If you have any results, can you share, please? Please, thank you.
Martin.
Yeah, thank you. My question is similar to Julia. I think I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the local context. I mean, you've chosen to tell us something very interesting about some specific actors and specific issues, but I suppose I'm wondering, what is the local politics of this, to what extent, what are the broader forces that drive attitudes or politics of reception at the local level? And maybe it links to a larger question, which you may or may not want to answer, but I might be wrong, and I'm not an expert in this particular literature. But my reading of literature often is in Europe, when we read about kind of local governance, it's always framed in a fairly positive way. To suggest that there's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of things. But if you compare this to, for example, to the United States, when we read about states, and we hear more negative tendencies that basically at the local level things might be happening that might actually undermine rather than help integration. So I'm just wondering whether you might want to comment on that. So based on your research, is your sense that overall what's happening at the local level is helping or hindering integration and positive reception experiences?
Davide, do you want to take these for now? And then I have questions, and we probably have a couple of minutes for a very quick second round.
About knowledge acquisition, I see your point. The knowledge acquisition is a crucial aspect of the relationship between reception, and when we talk about the reception, we refer to people working inside reception, beneficiaries, the managing institution, and for example, crucial aspect is if the managing institution is part of the territorial context or not. If people working for a reception, operator, worker, and so on, if they belong to the local context, the context where the reception facility is. Many of the situation we have explored, for example, tend to hire worker directly from the context. This is a crucial factor in the perspective to create a virtuous interconnection with the local area. That can be translated into many opportunities for working for refugees and asylum seekers. Many farms or firms where they can have work experiences. So to have a worker that belonging to the context is a key issue. I think also for the aspect of knowledge acquisition, because they can have access to knowledge of people to boost networking, the creation of new networks, to create exchanges with other municipalities, social services consortium, and so. So the knowledge acquisition is related to both the actor, the reception actors, and local actors. But is also a matter of politicization, because in some cases we observe that the knowledge acquisition over time can produce mutuality, reciprocity, and so on. The other question about the table showing the interconnection, our analytical framework showing the interconnection between reception and territories that tend to underline the positive aspect, if I understand. I have said before that we are aware that this aspect can be declined also in a negative way, because that is what is happened in some context. For example, you talk about the situation in some southern regions in Italy concerning the hiring of refugees and asylum seekers as a worker in agricultural sectors, for example, I suppose. We are aware that cases we have explored are only a part of the story, but there are two considerations about our choice. The first one is that it's quite surprising that this kind of positive interconnection are an unplanned effect. Because in some context we observe difficulties, problematic situation, in other not. If we take into consideration positive interconnection, we can explore which are the actors involved, which are the relationship among those actors, how they develop over time, and to understand which are the the crucial aspect to create and produce this kind of effect. In the second question is that we observe many regulatory and normative changes, but normative changes tend to not take into consideration the potential, the transformative potential of reception in local context. This discourse is a bit more complicated if we take into consideration urban spaces, but in urban context that are problematic for many reasons I talk above. The presence of migrants can become a factor able to trigger some positive effect in combination with other effects. And this sort of situation that we observe in different territories is not at the center of the attention of government or national institution. And this is also the reasons why the reasons because we have not paid attention to the movement, the mobility of refugees and asylum seekers, because in those areas the main mobility was that of humanitarians, and this is also a negative effect produced by the introduction of Salvini decrees. But for example, in the case of Ivrea, we observe the creation of a second cooperative with a project of social, agricultural, and the creation of a social farm involving many asylum seekers and refugees hosted in their facilities. I have to conclude, or
one more minute, if possible, and we also have a question from Enrico online. I'll just ask the question and then you decide which outstanding questions you want to pick. Enrico asks if there are differences between the STRA system and the CAS system, since the STRA is managed by local authorities usually, and the CAS instead is managed by cooperatives and by the prefecture. So the question is whether the 2018 reform also had a different impact on those two. But please 1 minute, because then we have to move to the next presentation.
Okay, and briefly, there are some differences, but criterion, central important criterion to select cases is that the fact that cooperative managing reception, both STRAs, SCRIMI or CAS tend to follow and assure the same quality of services, both for CAS and STRA. In the case of Irpinia, the managing institution decided not to open a CAS.
Thanks a lot, Davide. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll share a link to the paper that has been published already after this webinar. And now we move to the next presentation by Lilian. This is Lilian Zurdi. She is a professor in the law faculty at the University of Maastricht. She's also returning to the European University Institute, where she previously was a Max Weber Fellow and also a research associate to the Migration Policy Center. If I understand correctly, this is an ongoing project, so we are very excited to hear more about it. And the title of the project is, for now, Governing Migration Through Funding. Lilian, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lorenzo, and thank you to the Migration Policy Center for the kind invitation. It is indeed good to be back, and it's good that the Migration Policy Center has, since the outset, also had a place for law within an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary setting. So indeed, I will be presenting ongoing research and, in fact, interconnected research lines, but we will get to that. So the basic background is a shift in EU governance through funding, with EU funds and funding moving from a corollary of the policymaking process, or in the area of migration, even symbolic politics, as some authors had in the earlier in the 90s described intra-EU migration funding, to a rather important non-regulatory policy instrument that is becoming to play the complex link between policy formulation and policy implementation. So this is the policy background. Scientifically, this comes within a strand of legal and interdisciplinary literature looking into the governance of EU integration, the so-called new governance, so moving beyond harmonization through law, which mainly focused on processes with a steering potential, such as the open method of coordination. Later, other authors began to look at the limits of classic enforcement measures. So Anderson, this is a monograph, for example, on the role of the Commission as enforcer, so what we more typically connect with enforcement in EU law, and moving to a rather recent, let's say, phenomenon, which is the potential of EU funding to perhaps govern and steer policy implementation. And beyond the migration area, there are authors that have started to untangle this, looking into conditionality, for example, in the cohesion funds, looking into the adoption of rule of law conditionality within the EU, and also very recently and importantly, looking into the governance and regulatory implications of actually the new generation EU, so the post-COVID recovery fund. And while these are studies that are focusing mainly, I would say, on the legal design, they begin also to tease out what are actually the implications for more broadly the governance of the EU integration project through this emergence, let's say, emerging importance of funding. So against this background, and as you see, this is definitely not a paper because this is a handful and this is not something that I'm undertaking single-handedly, are these research lines where we are looking into the theoretical and normative underpinnings of governing, in the one hand, external migration through funding, and in the other of governing through funding within the EU more broadly. And I will mention who is also joining me in these lines. And they do not only revolve around legal design or the law, but they also integrate empirical insights into administration modes of EU funding through a number of case studies. So in the case of the external dimension, this is national case studies. In the case of governing through funding in the EU, this is an entire policy area being a case study. For example, I'm looking into migration. And within there, we are also looking into the mobilization of EU funding and financial accountability by EU institutions and bodies. So maybe they're less known enforcement functions or functions with a steering potential rather than the classic enforcement functions. The impact on refugee fundamental rights and the rule of law of these developments, and whether oversight and accountability, existing oversight and accountability, can counteract these challenges, and how could policy be reformed also on the basis of this legal and empirical analysis. And so, as I mentioned, this is an interdisciplinary research lines which bridge law and political science, mainly from the lens of public policy and international relations. And while these are also broader publication projects, so you see who is also working with me in this project. So in the governance through funding in the EU, it is a colleague, Marijn van der Slees from Maastricht University, who is a specialist in constitutional law and economic governance. And in the external financial governance, it is a public policy specialist, Federica Zardo, who is also running a research project in these areas. And we have several authors. And as this is the UI, some of the authors are within this room, like Bruno De Vite, who is looking into the constitutional implications of governing through funding, or hiding in a corner there, we have Michele Gilli, who is actually looking into the steering potential of the European Parliament's financial related functions, such as the discharge procedure, or Melte Minelli-Gier, who together with Orçun Olusoy have joined us in the external financial governance line with a case study specifically on Turkey. So within then these lines, I am also conducting research. These were two research projects. The one, the Veni project, more focusing on the internal dimension, the impact in intra-EU solidarity and internal steering. And then there is a related project, the so-called STIA project, where I was joined with a researcher who is originally also from Afghanistan to look into the case study of Afghanistan. So presenting now some aspects of the background of where let's say financial governance in migration rests, and also what is the link between funding and solidarity within the EU from a legal perspective. So there is literature and also relevant provisions within the treaty pointing to solidarity being a foundational EU legal principle underpinning the entire integration project. But of course, not all of these provisions are legally binding. Some are more of an aspirational normative status. And then what we find is islands of solidarity as they have been described within the treaties, so giving more specific legal precisions for different areas within the EU integration project. But overall, we have an absence of a solidaristic redistributive logic, so that, for example, wealthier member states would fund, if you will, or would cover for budget deficits in underperforming member states. Quite the opposite. The only element, so traditionally within the EU integration project, that had this more solidaristic conception was territorial cohesion. So the regional cohesion policy aiming to develop that is even structured on the subnational level. So aiming to help the development of regions, different regions within the EU that were perhaps lagging a bit behind. And it has been underpinned through funding. So what is the role of funding now, more specifically within migration, where we have a rather strong provision on solidarity and fair sharing of responsibility at the intra-EU level that can be understood from the analysis of the legal text as a structural demand for solidarity plus, even to the level where responsibilities are shared fairly between the member states, which includes a financial sharing component, but is not limited into this component. So there is quite a heightened, if you want, legally solidarity imperative. But of course, as we know, this is not the reality, neither in terms of legal design of these policies, neither the realities on the ground. On the other hand, the responsibility sharing at the global level, if we think of refugee protection, is not somehow established through a concrete binding obligation, neither has it attained the level of custom. So then the activities, let's say, or the undertakings of states at the global level, whether we are looking into financial sharing or resettlement, etc., are understood as non-binding, so voluntary solidarity related undertakings. And how is solidarity realized in the intra-EU level? This is a framework also evoked by Gregor Knoll, who spoke about different modes of solidarity, financial sharing being one of them, operational sharing. Here we have the workings also of EU agencies. That is another parallel development, physical sharing, meaning into the intra-EU redistribution of asylum seekers and beneficiaries, and normative sharing, which might be, you might think it is strange that it is included, but it is there to avoid legislative dumping. So in a way, the whole harmonization project of the EU avoids that there will be a regulatory competition to the bottom for member states to abdicate, let's say, responsibilities. Of course, there are ways to move beyond that. So how has financial sharing been realized in EU migration? Initially, the amounts that were available were such that, as I mentioned in the literature, they were understood as symbolic politics. And what we had were only moderate shifts, for example, with the establishment of emergency funding. At the beginning, it was linked with the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, but for 20 years this had been inactive. So this funding was just completely out of reach for member states. And at some point, the design of the funds changed so that they could tap into it. So this is the greatest, let's say, solidaristic element of the funds, is this emergency component where we can even have 100% financing through the EU. In general, one needs to understand that the funds were not designed in a compensatory logic. So they are not there to fully compensate member states for their efforts and for their costs in running, let's say, external border control or a functioning asylum system with reception provision, etc., etc. They had at the beginning more of a modest top-up function. And when at the beginning of 2010, Tilleman with colleagues had tried to, these are not data that are aggregated, but they had tried to understand about what percentage of national spending is covered by funds. They had found something like 10 to 14%. So rather marginal. So since then, there has been an overall boost, let's say, in funding volumes, but nothing that is meant as a structural design to come close to a compensatory logic, and still absorbing EU funding costs in itself. So these are also intricate systems of control, and several member states, this is why I said that the emergency component is very important. They were not able to absorb EU funding because for large periods of time, they were not able to make available the co-financing, for example, percentage. Or when the rules were less flexible, they were not able to absorb the EU funding administratively. The windows were just too small. We had annual programming and they didn't have time to construct, let's say, and implement the program in this annual cycle because they were overwhelmed. So some of these design issues have, let's say, alleviated a bit of a few of these concerns, but in general, the logic, as I said, is not compensatory, and also the sharing is on based on imperfect indicators that cannot speak as to relative pressure. So they are absolute indicators. For example, number of asylum applications, but not as distributed per, for example, the GDP population, etc., etc. So they are based on absolute indicators. So what has happened to cover some of these gaps is a kind of patchwork where we have had first the activation of the civil protection mechanism, which is there to provide in-kind resources for migration-related purposes also, and that is not very well known. In 2016, we had the birth of an intra-EU humanitarian aid budget line. Until then, humanitarian aid was meant only to be targeted in the external dimension, and its first triggering in 2 tranches that ran until 2022 was directed to Greece. Overall, there is this necessity for structural and compensatory forms of funding, but for now, what we have is this patchwork made up together through emergency handings and emergency-driven measures. So in terms of the steering potential of EU funding, we have this multi-annual now policy planning where there is a policy, an initial policy dialogue where also the Commission is more heavily involved, so there a greater steering potential. And also there was a midterm review, but in the previous period, it was supposed to be connected with an additional tranche of funding that would have been made available on performance-based, let's say, indicators, but this was taken out during the negotiations. So it had less teeth. And there is supposed to be a partnership principle in all stages of development, design, implementation, and control of the funding. So involving civil society and other relevant organizations. So if this is the trajectory internally, we have also a lot of developments bubbling up in the external dimension, where funding has passed from a rather marginal role with small-scale project-based regional protection and development programs, or small amounts of a lump sum to be available per member state, per resettled refugee, to a rather important non-regulatory tool that is gaining prominence in the external relations of the EU. So one of the developments was that beyond the strict, let's say, external dimension of migration-related funding, we have significant amounts of broader external affairs funds that were until then heavily geared towards development and poverty reduction or humanitarian aid. We have these different funding lines turned also towards migration and migration management through this broad understanding of development, which includes them. We had, in order to pool also member state funding and often private funding, the creation of ad hoc trust funds and facilities that have been the object of scrutiny increasingly through scholars, which also are based, thinking of the steering potential, on a logic of conditionality, but I'm not referring to human rights compliance conditionality. I am referring to conditionality with migration management objectives. So performance in migration management conditions the dispersal or continuing stream of funding, a framework that the EU has not always, though, applied, as Meltem, for example, can tell us about the case study of Turkey. And then what we've had is a broadening of the geographic focus from the immediate neighborhood towards countries further along the transit line. So what has happened here, also in terms of calls of transparency, lack of transparency and accountability of these ad hoc funds that were adopted on kind of emergency legal basis that did not foresee the structural involvement of the European Parliament, is the streamlining of several funding lines, which also replace trust funds into a single development, if you want, neighborhood and development cooperation instrument, which earmarks a particular amount towards migration and forced displacement, and includes positive conditionality, so that a further 10% of the budget of the fund can be made available upon good performance, let's say also migration management objectives, but it does not condition the basic national programs. Another development is joint programming at EU level, trying to somehow institutionalize further this joint funding optimization and pooling approach. So these are frameworks that are not only specific to migration. They actually started in the post-COVID area as a coordinated approach to joint challenges, and some are geared within the migration area, including a broad range of activities, so from anti-smuggling to readmission and protection. And there, these also allow for the pooling and the streamlining of EU member states and private funding. So we see this as becoming a structural feature and a forward-looking development is this adoption of talent partnerships as a comprehensive framework, adopting this whole of government approach that will bring together labor mobility, opportunities, training, and even vocational training in the countries of origin, some of which will be targeted to preparing, let's say, a workforce to migrate to Europe, but also targeted at local development and integration in the national labor markets. And here there is very much the thinking and the wish that the private sector and industry will be involved in the design, but also operationalization, so funding of these schemes that might become a vector of a broader EU cooperation with third countries in migration and development issues. So some preliminary findings from our empirics, and whereas Nasrat has fully finished his coding, his qualitative coding, mine is ongoing from my interviews, but there are already some preliminary findings we can point to. The first one surprised me. So thinking of the study that I mentioned previously with Eiko Tielemans and others who at the beginning of 2010s, they found that actually the EU funding, let's say, was covering a marginal, let's say, only percentage of national spending in some cases, but also this is through the activation of the patchwork. So it depends also on the ingenuity of member states. But for example, in the case of Greece, I was surprised myself to find, and these numbers are not available, let's say, they crunched them for the interview, that about 75 of 8 or to 80% of the national spending for the year 2021 came through various sources of EU funding, but not in a sustainable way. So through emergency headings, through the intra-EU humanitarian aid that I mentioned, where the plug was pulled into end of 2022, for example, for the intra-EU humanitarian aid, and already a program of housing asylum applicants in the private rental market through a facilitated way, which had offered, so the Estia project, which had offered 20,000 positions, was pulled out. And then this population was directed to camps, which were supposed to be emergency camps in the mainland, but which have become now a structural feature. So we see that there is this need for compensatory and structural funding, and that this fluctuation, let's say, through the patchwork, leads to lessening of the quality or possibility for delivery. So despite then, on the second point, despite these pronouncements and even strengthening in the new MFF of the partnership principle, empirically, it looks like it was often more of a box-ticking exercise, which speaks as to less opportunities for non-governmental and other actors to steer, let's say, the funding design and implementation. And this was very much also the case, this kind of top-down design in the external dimension. So in Nasrat's case study, in relation to how these programs in their overarching framework were designed, so mainly together with IOs and the EU, ignoring local realities on the ground. Funding also, because of its increasing volume, is becoming influential in national policy direction in migration. So as in what has come empirically is that, yes, specific actions, let's say, were adopted because of the discussions, let's say, within the EU, and that both referring to the internal and external level. But this increasing cooptation of the EU goes also both ways, in the sense that then, for example, there are quotes coming from the interviews where governmental, let's say, actors would say, well, these centers are also financed by the EU. The EU is not intervening, is not telling me that something is wrong. So this means that these centers are running in respect of all fundamental rights. Otherwise, the EU would have pulled the funding plug. Or when we are thinking into the external dimension, this, let's say, there are already other colleagues who are non-governmental actors. Funding is necessary, but not sufficient to operationalize solidarity. So I was also asking this normative question. So even if funding was redesigned in a way that it was possible to structurally cover needs and also to their entirety, let's say, combined with operational sharing, this was not considered as a desired, let's say, or sufficient policy solution by the stakeholders, who all mentioned in the internal dimension that also some level of physical sharing needs to take place. And in the external dimension, they have come back to Nasrat with things from root causes. So they're not, of course, empirically, their solutions are sometimes disproven. So the migration development nexus, etc. But the common point was that they did not believe that solidarity can operationalize solely through EU funding. So what's coming up as this, as I said, was also in a broader research lines that are ongoing. So there is the scientific component that we are pursuing, and here are two relevant events. One took place, the other is happening in hybrid mode on the 15th and 16th. So on the governing through funding in the EU. So for those interested, it is possible to follow also online, but also there is this policy and policy recommendation dimension that we try to develop. So how could funding, let's say, be redesigned, or what direction should it take? Here, this is a recent policy note for the EPC, together with Federica Zardo and Nasrat Sayed, on the external dimension and how to, let's say, achieve a sustainable collaboration. So many thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thanks, Ilian. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I already see 2 hands raised. So let's start right away, please.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I have a couple of questions on. The first is on. I'm really interested in the when you mention the influence in national policy, exactly how the EU measure this good performance in terms of management of migration. You have mentioned there are several indicators that they are evaluating, and also related to this question, but at a different level. Because researching Europeanization, that you can say that this is a form of Europeanization, how the EU is impacting on the governance of migration, or the regulation of migration, how you evaluate if there is this influence or not, because you have mentioned that sometimes national politicians argue that
they are doing on their own, there is no influence from the EU. In terms of methodological terms, how do you really evaluate if there is this Europeanization or not? That I always have found that is really, really difficult. And the last question was on the concept of solidarity. That you mentioned that this is not an active funding mechanism to operationalize solidarity, but in your ongoing discussions, what exactly is the concept that you are using of solidarity in terms of sharing resources, behavior, discourse? There is a flexible concept that there are many definitions there. Then I would be interested to see exactly how you are dealing with this concept.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Christoph Roos, I'm a visiting fellow here at the MPC. I think you're charting new ground by this research project. Funding is extremely interesting, considering all the conflicts that we have on national levels about redistribution, and on the EU level, it seems to be like the funds seem to be there, and we question like, where's the conflict? So my question is, what are you exactly doing in this project? Because there's so much you have been telling us now, and I wondered, like, are you looking at the politics of funding, like who gives, who takes, who lobbies for funding, and why? Like, I've recently gone into commission work, studying the commission and discovering, well, they chart their, or they frame their stuff in a way, only in a way that they can receive funding afterwards. Like everything else that would not imply any funding, they actually do not cover. And the other question is, or do you more look into the effects of increasing EU funding in terms of replacing EU legislation that does not come about? And my third question is more on the empirical level. I find it incredibly difficult to follow all these funding lines because they dry up, they are repurposed. The question is, who keeps track of where the money comes, where it goes, and how it is spent? Thank you.
I saw many hands. We have another question online. So if you agree, we will collect all the questions. You will answer a few, and you will leave other questions floating for future discussions. I will read out loud the question we received again from Enrico on YouTube. So Lilian, you mentioned towards the end of your presentation that some state members argue that these are EU-funded facilities, and the EU is not complaining, is still funding those facilities. So they conclude that these centers are compliant with fundamental rights. Can you please elaborate a bit further on these? I saw the hand of Meltem. Also, Julia, please raise your hand or write down the question on the chat.
Hi. Meltem Niljar, Jean-Monnet Fellow, MPC. Thank you very much, Lilian. I think this is a great project, a very under-researched area, and I'm always happy to be included to the EU-Turkey Statement Funds. My question, actually just a comment first, because your findings actually approve our findings in the Asyl project, that the top-down approach, we found the same things, and also that the funding is being operationalized for migration management with an increasing focus on securitization. And this is our findings are I think overlap in this. But what was quite interesting for me is that because I am looking at EU Turkey funds for a lot of years, I would say normally most of the studies focus on EU funding. And for instance, for facility for refugees, FRIT funding, we can see the projects, how much is spent on which project, on what. But member state funding is very hard to find, because we know there are a lot of projects being funded by, for instance, the Netherlands and the let's say the government of Belgium and the United Kingdom, not EU per se now, but we cannot find a comprehensive account of these projects. I know because I work as consultant in some of these projects, so I know some particular migration management projects are funded by certain governments, by the EU member states, but we do not have a comprehensive account of this. How do you plan, or like the researchers examining this, how do you think you can compile all the projects, which I'm really interested. The second is a comment and a question. We see, for instance, EU Turkey state funds, the 6 billion euros was much still focused on protection of Syrians in Turkey. So it's like humanitarian aid, development aid. But last year, the EU declared 1.5 billion euros additional grant, not particularly in the framework of EU-Turkey statement, but additional 1+ billion euros. But the projects they declared they will be funding is mostly border management, securitization of borders, border walls, increasing number of removal centers. So it is much more now security focused, and it is very clear now. Do you see that in other third country cooperation managements as well? Thank you.
Julia, did you have a 10-second question?
I think my question was already partially addressed. I'm interested, like, does this EU financial solidarity presupposes a financial trust? And like, in what way, what mechanisms of control the EU has for this funds, especially in case of emergency funds in countries where, well, where are known as kind of more corrupted ones. So this is related to the question that we already asked. Thank you.
Lilian, you have 4 minutes.
Oh, nice. So thank you all for your questions, and it's good to be in this room with such knowledge around. I will pick some here and there, some points. So first, Christoph, thank you very much for your comments. And also it's an opportunity to speak about your work going beyond Eurocentric framings, where you have looked also together with Florian Trauner and Ilke Adam, the impact of at the politics level, because you asked me also, are you looking at the politics level in Western Africa? So very much commendable. So I'm not looking into the politics, I'm looking more into the effects. And I'm also, my approach is one of administrative governance. So I'm also trying to see what does this mean in an administrative implementation perspective. So how does this shift previous balances? How does this shift beyond, if you want, executive federalism, which was the initial implementation design? But this is, of course, another interesting parallel line, what you have just mentioned. So looking into it's not something that I will pursue, but looking also into the politics dimension would definitely be something interesting. To connect then to the first question, I have not forgotten you. So we are not in any, because you mentioned how do you measure, and is it the effectiveness, let's say, how do we measure or the effectiveness or the steering potential? We are certainly not aiming to a kind of performance audit that the Court of Auditors is undertaking, or having any such, if you want, specific strict measurements, as in taking particular projects and then looking into their aims. So that is not the inquiry, let's say, of going into this level, more through because there are, I'm a legal scholar that's undertaking interdisciplinary work. So in law, you often see a legal design, let's say, and a new trajectory that was meant through the law. But then the issue is, has this had any impact in practice, or what is happening in reality? So to move beyond the kind of formal legal direction. So in this sense, then looking into whether it is, let's say, steering policy. So does it, so through empirical, let's say, work, through semi-structured interviews, expert semi-structured interviews, etc., to try to gauge what has been the impact, but definitely not in a kind of in-depth performance, let's say, audit way, or with such indicators, more to see what is going on with these shifts, let's say, that are formally stated on paper through a legal level. What is their impact, let's say, in practice? And Some other questions. So yes, Meltem, also to say we are a small team. You could see this as a kind of let's say test phase. So I do hope to develop the project in its financial components and more broadly into this soft enforcement in migration, if you will, research theme more broadly. But we certainly at this point, we as in me and Asrat definitely don't have the capacity to look into the overall levels of funding in the external dimension and what also member states are having this kind of exhaustive, let's say, tracking. So what we were able to look in this was just N is one case study, Afghanistan, and in the external dimension. And then it is the work of other scholars such as yourself that for now is coming within this research line. But ECRE, in its follow the money studies, tried to track what you are saying. So the member state component of the external dimension funding, and they were unable to do so. So they tried for a study for the European Parliament. They tried through these projects that they are running with UNHCR for 4 years. So this was one of the policy recommendations that we had, is that yes, the NDICI has a marker, so the new external development fund, and from there we will have some overview on what is related, let's say, with the NDICI, but we said have such a marker running through the talent partnerships at least, so that we will be able to have a single registry when we have a cooperation with one country that is supposed to bring everything together, to try to understand at least what is happening on a single country level, because otherwise there are so many, as you said, research lines, research funding lines and DGs, et cetera, that it is almost impossible to trace these funds. This was one of the ECRE, let's say, results, was it's impossible to follow this money as it is not traced as such also at EU level. So maybe I stop here because of the 4 minutes, but this is something that is very much ongoing, and I look forward also to future research and collaboration.
Thanks a lot, Lilian. You can blame it on as a very strict chair. If you want to hear more, as Lilian mentioned, she's going to present on the 15th of May. However, on the 15th of May, on the same day, we also have our next seminar organized by the Migration Policy Center, and we will talk about migrant student mobility, resilience, and reform during the pandemic, with a presentation by Luis Volante. So please stay tuned. We will share with all the participants of today's seminar the paper, authored by Davide, Leila, and Magda. And if the presenters agree, we will also share the slides with everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again on the 15th of May or any other event organized by the MPC. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Davide and Lilian.